I've been asked by the organizers of this online seminar on new thinking on investment treaties to give a brief overview, a couple of minutes, of the main findings and conclusions in a book that I published recently called Bounded Rationality and Economic Diplomacy, the Politics of Investment Treaties in Developing Countries. The book asks a simple and foundational question for the investment treaty regime, namely, why did so many developing countries sign up to investment treaties, despite the fact that those agreements constrain their regulatory authority and expose them to expensive arbitration claims? And I addressed that question using a range of different empirical methods. I used archival studies, I used statistical work, and I interviewed a very large number of previous negotiators of investment treaties in both developing and developed states around the world. And the first finding of the book is quite simple, but nevertheless important, namely that by far the most important justification used by developing states when entering into investment treaties, at least in the past, was that by doing so, they would become more attractive investment destinations. Often there was a perception that without these agreements, it would be very difficult to attract foreign direct investment and multinational corporations. And in a sense, that justification was not too surprising because that was also the message that many developing states received from Western countries and international organizations. Here we have some snippets from internal documents from the United Kingdom in the 1970s. When the UK was negotiating with developing states at the time, they would always initiate the negotiations with the following message to the developing country partner. Bilateral investment treaties can assist significantly in the creation of a climate of confidence which would encourage further substantial investment. Internally, however, amongst British agencies, there was a realization that whereas these agreements will be very much in our own interests, it might not serve the interests of developing countries equally well. In particular, we could not confidently promise them a substantial increase of British investment were they to conclude such agreements. Apart from Western governments, international organizations, also Western lawyers were very important in spreading the idea and the perception that by entering into investment treaties, developing countries will be able to attract greater amounts of foreign direct investment. The American Bar Association, for instance, played a very important role in the former Soviet bloc in promoting consent to investment treaty arbitration. And when advising countries like Romania, Albania, and Lithuania to sign up to investment treaties and sign up to the Exit Convention, the core justification was typically that by doing so, these countries would be able to attract greater amounts of FDI, or foreign investment. The second part of the book addresses not the potential benefits that developing countries expected from investment treaties, but addresses the question of whether or not the same governments appreciated the risks, appreciated the potential liabilities they were signing up to. So while they may have had somewhat inflated and optimistic views towards the economic benefits of the agreements, did they at least appreciate that what they were undertaking was signing up to very significant and potent legal obligations? And the basic answer to that question is that the vast majority of developing countries, there were exceptions, but the vast majority did not appreciate the risks. Let me just give you a couple of examples. There's far more information in the book. In the case of Pakistan, internal government official files today admit that investment treaties were not negotiated as strong, binding, and potent agreements. Rather, they were initially seen as instruments that were signed during visits of high-level delegations to provide for photo opportunities. The case of Mexico, a previous negotiator says, during the 1990s, BITs were a very different animal than free trade agreements, the WTO, and other globalization instruments. Many here in Latin America thought it was harmless to sign these treaties. No one had an idea what they meant. They just signed them off within a few days or hours. There was no legal review, there was no control, and there was no scrutiny of the content. No one cared until the dispute came. Moving to Africa, in the case of South Africa, some previous negotiators there said, we used to call these apple pie agreements. And it's not until we got sued that we truly realized that we should have had our red flags up when signing these treaties. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, if we go to the case of Croatia, a previous negotiator notes there were no cases against Croatia itself, so we didn't think that these agreements were that important. But after we were hit in 2004, we now understand the relevance and the power of BITs. And finally, in the case of Thailand, a previous negotiator notes that few took BITs very seriously. We put the best people in agreements with high priority, such as free trade agreements, and the shift in attitude came with the first claim against Thailand by a German investor. As I mentioned, there were exceptions. Some developing countries were exceptionally well prepared and knew exactly what they were doing when they were negotiating these agreements, but they were the exception, not the rule. So the main conclusions coming from this work is that many developing countries had somewhat optimistic views about the economic benefits of investment treaties, partly because those views have been promoted by Western states and international organizations. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, during the late 1980s and 1990s and up through the early 2000s, most developing countries, not all, but most developing countries, entirely ignored the risks of the agreements. And it was typically not until developing countries themselves became subject to their first investment treaty claims that officials realized just exactly what they had signed up to over the last many years. Now, this, of course, raises a series of questions that are relevant to the current investment treaty regime and the challenging policy reforms that are being pursued in different corners of the world. And I go into that in some amount of detail in the book as well. But I hope this at least have spurred your interest, and I'd be happy to discuss it further if you'd like to contact me on my email address. That's l.poulsen@ucl.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.